Hey guys, Shafsky here with your Chapter 14 video lecture. It's called Andrew Jackson, the People's President, and let's get right into it. First of all, I want to give you a little background on Andrew Jackson. You actually have met him in the Chapter 13 video lecture, but just briefly. Jackson was born in 1767 in the state of South Carolina, okay, kind of in the frontier section, so kind of in the western part of South Carolina, getting up close to the Appalachian Mountains. And the fact is, his father died before he was even born, so he was born to a very poor family. In fact, this is a drawing of the little cabin where he grew up. So he was really poor growing up. But he did go to school, and like a lot of boys back then and even today, he loved sports way more than he loved schoolwork. All right, remind you of anybody? But another characteristic of him that's going to be with him his whole life is he had a really bad temper. He would get into fights all the time in school. So that's kind of the type of kid he was. Now, at just the age of 13 is when the American Revolution started up, and he joined at the age of just 13, okay, about the age of you guys. He joined the local militia and started fighting in the American Revolution. And he was eventually captured by the British and was held as a prisoner. So that's all that you need to take on the notes. But this image right here is just kind of an interesting little story. You don't necessarily have to take notes on him, but it kind of adds to the legend of Andrew Jackson. So he was captured by the British, and basically this British officer here that you see basically demanded that this little teenage boy clean his boots. All right, so you can kind of see the boot cleaning stuff down here. And Andrew Jackson refused. He said, no way, I'm a prisoner of war. You got to treat me like a prisoner. I'm not your slave. I'm not going to clean your boots. And the British officer got so angry at him for being so disrespectful that he drew his sword and he actually swung at Andrew Jackson. Jackson kind of stopped it with his hand, but it cut his hand and kind of the side of his head, and he had scars that he would carry with him for the rest of his life. Okay? All right. So after the American Revolution is over, Jackson goes to work at a law office now in North Carolina. And while he's there, he decides to become a lawyer. And later, he moved west. He moved over the Appalachian Mountains into one of the new states of Tennessee. And he started a law practice there, and he became such a successful lawyer that eventually he was able to buy land and slaves, and he became a very kind of wealthy man, even though he had grown up very poor. So that's all you need to do for notes here. This image, though, shows Andrew Jackson's temper once again playing a role in his life. Turns out that this man over here, who's the other guy in the duel, his name was Charles Dickinson. And Dickinson and Jackson got into some quarrel, and Dickinson ended up calling Andrew Jackson a, quote, worthless scoundrel. Oh, and eventually, apparently back then those were fighting words, because Jackson challenged him to a duel. And even though Dickinson shot first and wounded Jackson in the leg, it didn't stop Jackson from firing his shot and basically killing Dickinson. So you can just see what a temper this guy Andrew Jackson had all throughout his life. Jackson eventually decided to enter politics, and he was elected to both the House of Representatives and even to the Senate from Tennessee. But he didn't become widely known around the United States until a certain war that we have studied. Okay, it's not the American Revolution, it's the war that comes after that. And he was a general in that war. Okay, remember, he was only a boy of 13 in the American Revolution. This is a different war. And it's this victory against the British in the Battle of, all right, I'll help you out here, and you have to figure the last part out yourself. It's in your notes if you forget. Okay? That battle turned him into a national hero. In fact, there were songs that were written about him and such. You may remember he just took a small army of about 7,000 troops with pirates and freed African American slaves, and he basically held off the British army. So that's the battle that helped him become a national figure and a national hero. Now, here's his information on his path to becoming the President of the United States. So, in the election of 1824, Jackson decides to run for president. So, this is about 10 years after the war that we were talking about. Don't want to give away the name, but the war that we were talking about is over. The problem about that election in 1824, if you look down here, there were 1, 2, 3, 4 candidates. Jackson's the one in green. And if you look up here at the popular vote, that means how many people voted, and the electoral vote, which means each state gets a certain number of electoral votes. That's still how we decide it. If you look, Jackson got the most votes in each category, but he didn't get a majority, and that was the key. Because back then, if you didn't get a simple majority, then the election went to the U.S. House of Representatives. And what happened in the U.S. House of Representatives is these two guys, Henry Clay, who's the kind of the orangey color, and John Quincy Adams, who's the pink color. He was also, by the way, the son of John Adams, who was the second President of the United States. They ended up sort of joining forces. And Clay gave all of his votes over to John Quincy Adams, which gave John Quincy Adams, as you can see here, enough to have a majority and beat Andrew Jackson. By the way, not coincidentally, Henry Clay became John Quincy Adams's Secretary of State once John Quincy Adams became president. Interesting. All right, so basically, long story short, Jackson loses the election even though he got more votes than anybody else. Here's the other thing, though, that I do want you to take a look at, and we'll come back to it in a minute. Look at the popular vote. That means the number of people who voted, okay? Back then, at that time in 1824, you had to be male, you had to be white, and generally speaking, you had to be a landowner. So you had to have some kind of wealth. And only 356,000 people voted in that election, okay? Things are going to change in 4 years. Just watch. Okay. Now, Jackson's supporters used the 4 years, the next 4 years until the next presidential election, to do a couple things. First of all, they created a new political party called the Democratic Party. Okay, Democratic with a capital D or a big D. Okay, and that's the same Democratic Party that we have today. All right, it's the same party that President Obama is part of. Okay. And this new Democratic Party promised that they would support not just the rich landowners, but they were going to be the party of the farmers and the workers and basically the poor people, kind of like the people that you see in this Hudson River Valley artwork. You know, people who are just out there kind of planting their own crops, they're building their own houses, a lot like the way Andrew Jackson lived when he grew up, okay? So that's going to be the people that the new Democratic Party promises to support. Okay? Here's another thing that happens in these 4 years from 1824 to 1828. All of a sudden during this time, there's a whole bunch of new western states that were forming west of, what are those mountains called? They're right here. It starts with an A, okay? All right, you probably remember. Anyway, states like Ohio, Kentucky, Indiana, Illinois, Tennessee, where Andrew Jackson now lives, right? Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, all of these new western states because they're west of these mountains, okay? Today we think of western states like California or Oregon or Washington. They weren't part of the United States yet. They belonged to other countries. These were the western states back then. Okay? And these new states led the way in changing a lot of the voting laws. Okay? Instead of having to be a white male landowner who owned a lot of land, and that meant you were fairly wealthy, all you had to do was be a white male adult. You didn't have to be a big landowner. You could be poor. Didn't really matter. Okay? So the voting laws were changing in those states. Now, they didn't change enough to include, what groups do you think? 3 groups were not included in that change, all right? Half of our class, okay, are one of the groups. Another group was people who might have been slaves at one time but then got freed. And then the third group would be the people who lived in this area before white people even ever came to America. So those were three groups that were not included in these new voting laws. But at least you didn't have to be wealthy anymore, okay, to vote for president. So in the election of 1828, all right, here's the key. Look at this popular vote number. Remember back in 1824, 4 years earlier, only a little over 350,000 people had voted. 4 years later, over 1,100,000 people voted. That's 3 times the number who had voted in 1824. Okay, huge, huge difference. Now, during the presidential campaign, Andrew Jackson's supporters worked really hard to reach these new kind of common people voters. So, you might want to write in here, common voters or common people. And they did a lot of new things that hadn't happened in presidential elections before. So I want to just point out 3 of them. First of all, campaign posters, okay? You would never have seen that in the time of George Washington, all right? So, and here they're kind of promoting Andrew Jackson as, look at this, a man of the people, okay, the man of the folk, all right? Even has a nickname, Old Hickory, all right? And another thing that they did that's common today, but it wasn't common before Andrew Jackson, was they had political rallies like this. So he's going from town to town on a stagecoach. When he gets to town, people all come because it's like, oh my God, it's a presidential candidate. He'd get up on the stagecoach, he'd give a speech, and you got all sorts of people there. You got probably some wealthy people, right? Okay? But you got some common people here too who are out to listen to Andrew Jackson, okay? So political rallies are a brand new thing that hadn't happened before, but they're still with us today. And then here's the last thing that I want to point out to you. This is the first campaign song that was ever written.
Ye gentlemen and ladies fair who grace this famous city, just listen if you've time to spare while I rehearse a ditty. For the opportunity, conceive yourself quite lucky. 'Tis not often here you see a hunter from Kentucky. Oh, Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky. Oh, Kentucky, the hunters of Kentucky.
All right, we might listen to a little bit more of that song in class on Thursday, but notice what style of music does that sound like? Think about those different styles. It's certainly not classical music, all right? And they're talking about what state, hunters from what state, all right? So notice just all the entire focus is really shifting from the original 13 colonies over to the western states more and more, okay? All right. Well, not surprisingly, and if you were paying attention, you saw it on this previous slide as well, okay? Andrew Jackson easily wins the election, okay? And over John Quincy Adams, the guy who had beat him 4 years earlier. And at Andrew Jackson's inauguration, over 10,000 people came to Washington, D.C. from every state in the Union, okay? That's something that had never happened before either. And there's some kind of funny stories about that inauguration day. One of the most funny ones is after Jackson was sworn in officially, okay, a huge crowd ends up following his, his coach here to the White House, all right? And they come in and they're tromping around in their muddy boots and getting the White House all messed up and dirty, and they're eating and they're drinking, and people are kind of getting into fights and stuff. You see this horse right here bucking up around, and it's basically symbolic of the fact that finally and for once, kind of the common people, okay, for the first time, many Americans felt that they had a president who was representing all the people, not just sort of the rich landowner types, but all of the people were now being represented. And basically, that's the question that we're going to look at in this chapter 14, is once Andrew Jackson becomes president, is he really what we would call, think about your vocabulary words, a Democrat with a small d, meaning he's trying to govern for all the people of the country. Or is he more just like a populist who just is doing things for the kind of the common people, the regular people, and not paying attention to anybody else? Okay, so that's something that we're going to be looking on throughout the chapter 14. Okay, so if you need to go back and check any parts of this, you can hit the rewind button. Otherwise, make sure that your notes are totally complete, that you've got some highlighted vocabulary words, at least one, and a colored labeled visual, because I'm going to be checking this first thing in class on Thursday. All right, guys, see you then.